democratic participation. You had, obviously, the working classes very involved in the First World War, paying a disproportionate price in terms of their lives, fighting in the First World War, coming back from the front, and having really no political status to speak of, right? Not even the right to vote. And so, between the interwar period, well, this started a bit earlier in the United Kingdom already with the Reform Acts in the 19th century, but if we want to speak to it generally, it took time for the working classes to be seen as something other than a potential fifth column of Moscow, right? Because their loyalties, their political, potential political extremism, their potential fealty to a foreign potentate, or prince in this case, Moscow, Lenin, Stalin, etc., also took time, right? But gradually, the working classes were enfranchised, were given the right to vote, were allowed to found their own associations, were allowed to create trade unions that were recognized by the state, and which similarly entered into negotiation with the state for the rights of that group. And again, the point here is not that, if you earn a certain salary, you have to be represented by, this union. But if you want to, and you feel that you belong to that group and you want to be represented by that association, then you may. Right? And so, this slow granting of group status, whether it's to minority Catholic churches, or to minority Jewish groups, or to working class groups, it led to the possibility of institutional privileges on the one hand, which is to say forms of equal treatment and equal participation, but it also meant to anchor those very organizations in a domestic framework, right? Because as you'll notice, with each group that was to be emancipated that I mentioned, there was always a fear of an international connection, always a fear of an international liaison that would outweigh their loyalty to the local authorities. And so these are not altogether unreasonable fears, right? There was such a thing as international Bolshevism, right? International revolutionary Bolshevism. There is such a thing as international jihadism, right? There is a kind of revolutionary jihadism that we can all name, and we can point to the actors of it, and who do indeed serve as a reference point for some people, even in our Western countries. But the point is that you don't get to just assume that, right? You have to give organizations the possibility to anchor themselves domestically, to prove their loyalty to a political system. And this is precisely what we see happen with Jews, with Catholics, with working classes, and now I would suggest also with Muslims, who in these state Islam encounters that I mentioned at the very beginning, these Islam councils, whether it's the conference in Germany or the Conseil in France, part of that process of recognizing the religion is also about asking them to acknowledge officially, formally, their acceptance of the constitutional order, right? Which is to say the superiority of the law of the land and the subordination of religious law, when necessary, to the law of the land. And that's not an easy process for any group. It's a difficult process because one can feel singled out and put on the spot, etc. But it's an important part of the process, which I think we do see happening time and again. And I'm insisting on these kind of these moments of formal group recognition because we seem to have come to a point where we assume that universal citizenship just is this concept which we can all understand, which doesn't need to be structured, that it's somehow like free markets, right? Everyone knows what free markets are and everyone knows what universal citizenship is. But the reality is that free markets are structured, right? We know that they're structured by myriad rules and regulations and recognitions and prohibitions and formal acknowledgement. And so too is citizenship, not just this sort of empty space, but just like free markets, citizenship is structured by a very complex set of rights and obligations, structures and institutions. Citizenship guarantees individual rights, which is fine enough, but it is the group status that you may acquire as a citizen, usually in the form of public law, right? If you think about, again, in the German case, but also in the French case, you can have a 1905 law association, which is a religious association. I'm sorry, in the back, I'm getting distracted by you guys. Thank you. You can have a 1905 law, which recognizes a religious community. You can have a Körperschaft, as right, a corporation of public law in the German case. And it's that group status that actually grants your religion rights in city halls, in parliaments, in government ministries, in the armed forces, in schools, in prisons, in hospitals, even in public streets, right? If you think about what you're allowed to wear as a member of a certain group. And so that's why I think it's very important to insist on this notion of group status accompanying the full rights of citizenship. So emancipation is not something that we can expect to occur overnight. It's a generational process, right? It's always taken time. And it's always been characterized by what I would call kind of a dual movement, right? With one hand, the state equalizes, the state enfranchises, right? It grants the right to vote, it liberates, it acknowledges collective identity. But on the other hand, it also forces adaptation, right? It forces the adaptation of community structures and institutions to the local set of laws, to the local circumstance. And so this shouldn't be seen as some kind of free pass, right, where, okay, once your religion is recognized, you have a green light to really do what you like. But rather, it's really it is a process that takes place both in the sense that the state gives, but also that the state demands in return. And that also, I think, is part of this healthy process. So we're still in the middle of this historic process, I think, for European Muslims. And, you know, I should say just for a moment that the phrase European Muslims is extremely problematic, right? It's not very helpful to talk about Muslims in general. It's not very helpful to talk about Europeans in general. I hope you'll sort of forgive the shorthand that I've been using here. But one could ask at this point, well, why do we keep on talking about religion? You know, I mean, certainly people are very complicated beings. Citizens are extremely complex. They have multiple belongings, multiple identities, multiple loyalties. Why always bring religion back into this discussion? Because you could argue that it is divisive, ultimately, right? That it just sort of points out the way in which people are different rather than emphasizing their commonalities. You could say that it contributes to communitarianism, right? Just by talking about it and talking about the need for recognition, that you're actually further dividing the society by forcing people who never really think about it to say, oh yeah, well, what is it that that person really believes, and what is their relationship to their deity and all of this? You could say that people are simply part of the society, right? They take their responsibility as citizens seriously. They don't want to be limited to an Islamic identity. They don't want to get driven into an ethnic corner. And that, of course, is all completely fine. There's no reason to pretend or to wish that Islamic identity is the defining characteristic of any human being, just like it would be hard to arrive at the defining characteristic for people from another religious group. And the reason why I've focused on religion and not, say, racial or ethnic categories or gender categories is because these Western European states, which all experience a very similar influx of labor migration from the same parts of the Mediterranean and other parts of the Muslim world, all have offices that handle religion, that regulate the relationship between religious communities and the state, that have a formal relationship with faith communities, that afford privileges to faith communities. And so naturally, especially when you have such an astronomically fast growth of a minority as we did in these Western European countries, the question is raised simply of, well, how do you reach this population in the interim time before they're fully politically integrated? Right? And this is an important question. This was a question that was also raised actually for the working classes in the interwar period. Because even after the working classes were granted the right to vote, you know, everyone's in Britain, right? By 1882, essentially, there were much of the working classes that had been enfranchised, and yet, if you looked at the composition of the House of Commons, not even to mention the House of Lords, looked at the composition of the House of Commons, you couldn't find a single person with any working class background for decades, right? And so what does it mean then? It means that you are a fully enfranchised group of citizens who, for structural reasons, is not quite able to break into parliamentary representative democracy yet. And so what do you do in the meanwhile, right? How do you convey this group's basic interests to the apparatus of the state in the absence of political representation? In interwar Europe, the solution was often economic and social councils, right, which were unelected bodies, but which brought in trade union leadership and sometimes had them sit down with you know, the employers or the industrialists of the time to discuss, well, okay, let's negotiate some wage issues. Let's try and avoid strike actions. To engage in a kind of extra-parliamentary political negotiation, not as a permanent solution, but as a kind of stopgap solution that would say, all right, well, until you have representation in Parliament and can exercise your full rights politically, let's at least make sure that, you know, the basics are covered. And we've seen the fruits of this already. You know, if we think about the Islam councils as similarly undemocratic, extra-parliamentary bodies, where you have people who are chosen not randomly, but certainly under special criteria to serve a semi-representative function, they are, and they have really come up already with some very concrete solutions, right? So this, in this academic year in Nordrhein-Westfalen, in Western Germany, you have several 100,000 Muslim students who for the first time are able to choose Islamic education as their religion option. Right? And that's quite quite a bit of progress. Right? If you think about in Strasbourg, right, in the east of France, which is still governed by a different state church regime than the rest of France, because it was part of the German Empire at the time that the 1905 law was passed. In Strasbourg, you have religious education for students of public schools, and you know, up until the late 1990s, the Muslim kids were essentially told, well, you know, what do you want to do during religion hour? Do you want to go, you know, to driver's education class or something else? There was no option for them in the same way that the other recognized religions could enjoy. And so to have now really increasingly common offering of religious education on an equal basis is quite revolutionary. Also, you know, I'm speaking about Germany a lot because I've been living there this year and so thinking a lot about it, but while I was there, even more has been happening, right? So the state of Hamburg signed a contract with 3 major Islamic federations there to recognize the religious community, to grant the possibility of taking days off for Eid, for have kind of holiday possibilities for people of the Muslim faith. I mentioned that across Europe you see more and more Islamic studies centers, formal chairs that are overseeing whether bachelor's or master's or PhD programs to train future teachers and imams and theologians. Now again, this is still at a relatively small scale, right? There, in a way, these small number of institutions can't possibly meet the demand yet for teachers and imams of the many millions of school-age Muslim children across Europe. And that's part of why what I described earlier is taking place, where the countries of origin are still stepping in very much to fill this gap. So what has this all added up to? You know, it's fair to ask. So, okay, you have some of these new symbolic instances of progress. How much does it matter, right? You may recall in September, or it was in August, there was this YouTube video that went viral. I think it was called The Innocence of Muslims. It was made by this guy in California who filmed this sort of fake movie about, you know, the nastiness of the conflict. And everyone was afraid, not only in the United States but also in Europe, of course, that this would be another occasion for, you know, protests, for violence, and indeed around the world there was some violence, in the same way that around the world there was some violence during the Danish cartoon crisis. And yet, if you look closely at what took place in Western Europe, both during the Danish cartoon crisis and this YouTube crisis, there was really no violence among Western Muslims, right? There were issues in Nigeria, there were issues in Pakistan, there were some issues in Syria, etc., but not in these Muslim minority contexts. And I think that the important thing to retain there is that even though you may have these kind of, you could think of them as acts of political arson, right? People who are looking to start a fire